This cool watch is called the Cave Dweller, and it's made by a micro brand named Boschett. It cost me $776 with shipping. To make this review a little more terse, I'll be referring to the Cave Dweller as the Caver. The Caver came in this substantial pleather watch box. This panel was empty when I got the watch. It's very useful for holding the links I removed from the bracelet when sizing it. On the door of this compartment is a proof of purchase card and a documentation card. I didn't remove the cellophane from the documentation card. Whatever documentation could be in there can't be much, and you don't need documentation for the Caver anyway. The warranty, which I didn't see, might be in the documentation. You could read about the 2-year warranty on the Boschett website. This cabinet came with 2 rubber straps. One is sealed in plastic that I'll leave alone as I don't want to tear it open. The other came in an unsealed plastic bag. I'll put this one on at the end of the video and let you know what I think about its quality. Also found in this cabinet was a multi-purpose watch tool with bits inside it to do bracelet sizing, bracelet removal, and probably even case back removal, but don't remove the case back. Just don't do it. The bracelet uses screw bars, which are similar to screw pins. You can use the provided watch tool to screw and unscrew the screw bars. The watch that I've reviewed, which comes closest to the Caver in style and specs, is the Helm Khuraburi, which cost vastly less at $330 with shipping. There are also some similarities between the Helm Komodo and the Caver, which I also reviewed and was $315 with shipping. The Caver has a better, more expensive movement than the Helms I've reviewed. I think the Caver looks better, has better build quality, and is certainly more adjustable due to its 1mm size and granularity and cool self-adjustable clasp feature. The Caver is certainly a better watch than the Helm, but is it $450 better? I suspect not. Though I really do love the Caver and endorse the watch despite its faults, which I'll get into. The Caver has an overbuilt, hypermasculine aesthetic. The Caver is more fashion statement than dive watch. The Caver is actually comfortable for its size, but comfort wasn't the primary intent of its design. I nor you should be complaining about the Caver's size, nor its insane depth rating of 1,000 meters, which can resist water pressure that is 3 times that of what the best divers in the world can tolerate. Moderation is not what the Caver is about, and if you're looking for this, you're looking for a different kind of dive watch. Having said this, I don't think the Caver is a super big watch. It's just super thick. The Caver has an almost cartoonishly thick dial at 17 millimeters and extremely thick 5mm bracelet links. The 44mm diameter puts it around midway point between a medium and large-sized diver. The lug-to-lug of 53mm is very large, but I don't get hung up on specs. What's important to me is how a watch feels when it's sized and worn on my wrist, and I think the Caver wears absolutely great. When wearing the Caver, I experience very little big watch syndrome. The crown doesn't poke into my wrist when I raise my hand, and I get minimal and tolerable wrist constriction when I lower my hand. The Caver is a little cumbersome because it's so heavy and thick, but it's a different experience for me than wearing a big watch. To give you some perspective on the Caver's size, I'm comparing the Caver in the right column to the 43mm in diameter, 13.5mm thick Seiko 5 Sports in the left column. I'm modeling both watches. My wrist is about 7 inches. I consider the Seiko 5 Sports a small leaning mid-size watch. The Caver is all brushed. The case is missing something this watch really has to have at this price point: drilled lug holes. The bracelet has a 22 millimeter width and has no taper. I suspect they didn't taper the bracelet, not because the designer thought it would have reduced the caver's hypermasculine appeal, but because it was more convenient and cost-effective to use the clasp they used, which looks sourced and was intended to connect to the end of a 22 millimeter bracelet. I was pretty certain before I put the caver on that the bracelet was going to wear great, despite its lack of taper, due to the fluidity of its links. Look at that. That's insane. I wouldn't say the edges are rough, but they're not smooth enough for my liking. I expect these edges to be at least as smooth as my sub-$200 Seiko 5 Sports. I know it's more difficult to smooth the caver's thick links, but that's why I'm paying Boschett the big bucks for a deluxe Manly Man watch as opposed to the economy Helm Manly Man watch. The clasp is pretty wide at 24 millimeters. The reason why I stated that the clasp is probably sourced is because of all the unnecessary clearance. The clasp could have been smaller. The sides of the clasp are smooth as hell. It has 3 micro adjusts. It was hard to measure them as they're so narrowly spaced. But I put them at being spaced apart about 1 millimeter. Because the watch also has a self-adjustable clasp with 4 positions, this gives you a sizing granularity of 1 millimeter. This means you are always going to get a perfect fit with the caver. I can't begin to tell you how great this is. One thing I don't like about the self-adjustment feature is that it only locks in one direction. You can't make it any looser without pressing the dual release push buttons. However, you can make it tighter without pressing the buttons. So when wearing the watch, you sometimes feel the clasp wanting to give a bit and become tighter, but it never gave enough to fully lock into a tighter position. This is a minor annoyance. You have to exert too much force for my comfort to close the clasp, and it seems to only want to close when you clamp it down at the end. Over time, the clasp might get a little easier to close. The clasp uses dual push buttons to open. Overall, I was pretty happy with the clasp despite its issues. The caseback has a lightly etched logo that is nothing to write home about. I don't think casebacks are that important. The crown is nicely sized, long yet not thick, which is good as there are no crown guards. The crown is grippy. I think the crown has a very slight wobble. I think the stem could have and should have been thicker at this price point. The action seems fine. Winding, screwing, and unscrewing the watch are fine. I love the case design. I especially love the lines on the lugs. The case integrates seamlessly with the bracelet. The end links fit pretty nicely. The bezel doesn't use an insert. The black ring on the bezel is a hardened PVD coating, and a nice job was done here. One thing that is going to be unacceptable to some people is the lack of lume on the caver's bezel markings. I personally find lumed bezel markings to be gimmicky and excessive. All you really need is a lumed pip, which the caver has. The bezel is 120 click. You can clearly see in the lume shot that it's off by about a click. For a watch that's pushing $800, I expect its bezel to line up exactly. The bezel isn't either thick or grippy enough to get a good grip of, and this, in combination with the bezel being super tight, make it virtually impossible to turn by holding its edges. In order to turn it, you need to press down simultaneously on both the front and the side of the bezel. The bezel might loosen up over time. At this price point, I expect a bezel that isn't a challenge to turn. The sapphire crystal seems to be flush with the bezel. This is optimal for visibility, as a raised bezel introduces some distortion at extreme angles. The bezel is slanted, giving it protection against direct hits. The crystal has a magenta tinted anti-reflective coating. Consistent with the Boschett's emphasis on readability, they didn't do a tint overkill. There's something to me about orange and yellow dials on dive watches that somehow makes the misery of life for me a little more tolerable. I love the dial background. I like the fairly conservative indexes. The shape of the hands is okay for me, but the hour and minute hands somehow look a little too small for the dial. Boschett gave me a completely over-the-top dive watch. Why not make the handset look a bit divier? With exception to the barely readable 26 jewels at the bottom of the dial, which I think is completely unnecessary, I like the writing on the dial. I especially like the Boschett in all caps. As someone with poor vision, I'd say the date is somewhat readable. The main issue with the date is that it's crammed into a too small cutout. Boschett, like many other watch designers, approached dates as something to mask and obscure. As you can see, there was plenty of room here to enlarge the date cutout and still have it line up perfectly with the 3 o'clock indexy. It probably would have looked better that way as well. I don't understand the logic of putting a date in a watch if it's going to be difficult to read. If your intent is to appease those who dislike dates, offer them a no-date variant of the watch instead. The Caver is an incredibly heavy watch, which is no surprise considering its bulk. Unsized, it's 254 grams, and sized is 274 grams. I have arthritis in my wrist, so super heavy watches are hard for me to wear. It's highly questionable if I would be able to wear the Caver over the long term. I'm comparing the Caver's lume to the Seiko 5 Sports on the left. The Caver's lume is superb. It held strong after 6 hours. Boschett uses Superluminova. Aesthetically, I find the Caver's cyan-colored lume to be the most pleasing to look at. The Caver uses the entry-level Swiss SELLITA SW200 movement. It is what is referred to as a high-beat movement, so the progression of the second hand is going to seem smoother than your typical Japanese entry-level movement, like what is in my Seiko 5 Sports. The SW200 is accurate to within plus or minus 30 seconds a day. On average, the SW200 is off by plus or minus 12 seconds a day. My Caver is running 3 seconds fast a day in the horizontal position and 5 seconds slow a day in the vertical position. The Caver doesn't have an ISO rating. I don't think this is a big deal. Aside from the Caver being too heavy for me, the Caver has a little too much wrist presence for my comfort. I generally don't like to talk to strangers, and I don't want people striking up conversations with me about my watch while I'm at the checkout line, unless, of course, those people happen to be hot or even mediocre-looking middle-aged women. I also wouldn't feel ecstatic about walking home late at night from work with such a visible and expensive watch on my wrist, as there are a lot of drug addicts where I live in downtown Brattleboro, and I'm sure they wouldn't hesitate to kill me for the Caver and not even feel guilty about it afterwards. The strap is fitted. I felt it to be a tad bit too stiff for my liking. I was also concerned that the strap material would act as a lint magnet. I adore the Caver. You can't make a watch as pretty and comfortable to wear as the Caver and not have me fall in love with it. The Caver does, however, fall short in some critical areas that a watch in the Caver's price point shouldn't be, such as ease of turning the bezel lineup, and link edge smoothness.